If you were around during Fortnite's first chapter, you probably remember the big moments. The meteor crashing into Dusty Depot, Kevin the Cube rolling across the island, the Ice King covering the map in snow, the monster fighting the mech, and of course, the black hole. Looking back, it's easy to think all of those events were separate stories. In reality, they were all part of one long chain of events that played out over nearly 2 years. Every season introduced another piece of the puzzle. Some questions were answered, while others wouldn't make sense until years later. By the time Chapter 1 came to an end, Fortnite had introduced the 0 point, the 7, and many of the ideas that still shape the game's story today. So today, we're going back to where it all started, from the first strange object that appeared in the sky to the moment the island disappeared forever. This is the complete story of Fortnite Chapter 1. When Fortnite first launched in September of 2017, there wasn't much of a story to follow. The island was simple. There weren't any live events, mysterious characters, or giant monsters lurking beneath the map. Most players logged on for one reason: to survive longer than everybody else and end up getting a victory royale. Week after week, the map stayed mostly the same. New weapons were added, a few locations changed here and there, but nothing suggested Epic Games was building a larger narrative behind the scenes. That's part of what made the next few months so memorable. The story didn't begin with a cutscene or a quest. It started with something players noticed on their own. Near the end of Season 3, people began spotting a tiny object high above the sky, and at first, it was easy to miss. It looked like nothing more than a bright speck in the sky. Some players thought it was a graphic bug, while others assumed it was just part of the background. But every update, it grew a little larger. Soon enough, the community realized they were all looking at the same thing. Something was heading straight for the island. The meteor had finally landed, but it wasn't the crater that held everybody's attention. It was what was buried inside it. Within days, the center of Dusty Divot was completely sealed off. Trucks surrounded the area, scientists moved in, and a massive research facility was built directly over the largest piece of the meteor. Whatever Epic Games was planning, they weren't giving players many answers. While the extraction continued, another discovery started appearing all across the island. Scattered among the smaller meteor fragments were glowing purple crystals known as hop rocks. Eating one of these sent players soaring through the air with low gravity, making them one of the most unique items Fortnite had added up to this point. At the time, they just seemed like a fun gameplay mechanic. But looking back, they were much more important than anybody realized. Week after week, players watched the construction site grow larger. Every update seemed to bring the scientists one step closer to whatever they had discovered beneath the meteor. Then one morning, everything inside the facility had changed. The meteor wasn't empty. Hidden inside was a massive escape pod. Whatever had traveled to the island inside that meteor had broken free. The mysterious figure became known as the Visitor, and almost immediately, players started asking the same question: who or what was he? The interesting part is that the Visitor never gave players an answer. He didn't speak, he didn't leave messages, and he didn't explain why he came to the island. Instead, he simply got to work. Before long, players discovered he had made his way to the villain lair, a location everyone had assumed was nothing more than part of Season 4's superhero theme. One thing Fortnite did incredibly well during Chapter 1 was letting players discover the story on their own. There weren't quest logs telling you exactly what was happening, or lengthy cutscenes explaining every detail. Most of that excitement came from logging in after an update and asking yourself, what had changed? That sense of discovery is a big reason so many players still remember Chapter 1 so fondly. Once the Visitor arrived at the villain lair, players started noticing changes every week. The rocket inside the base didn't look quite the same anymore. New pieces began appearing around it. Equipment was moved into the room. More importantly, the hop rocks that had been collected from around the island were now being transported into the base. And at first, nobody really knew why, but then it became obvious. The Visitor wasn't hiding, but instead, he was rebuilding the rocket. And on June 30th, 2018, Fortnite held its very first live event. Back then, nobody even knew what a Fortnite live event was. There wasn't years of history to look back on. Players simply loaded into a match because Epic had teased that something was going to happen. Millions of players stood together on hilltops, rooftops, and mountains, all staring towards the villain lair. Then the countdown reached 0. The rocket ignited. Slowly, it lifted lifted off the launch pad and climbed higher into the sky. Everything looked normal until the engines suddenly shut off. For just a moment, the rocket hung completely still. Then it tipped forward, and instead of continuing into space, it kept screaming back toward the island. If you were watching live, you probably remember exactly what everybody thought. Tilted Towers was about to be destroyed. The rocket locked onto the city and accelerated straight towards it. At the last possible second, it vanished. A glowing rift tore open in the sky where the rocket should have been. Seconds later, it burst back into view above Moisty Mire. Then it disappeared again. It raced across the island, diving through one rift and another before making one climb high above the island. This time, it didn't come back. Instead, the rocket punched a massive crack above the sky. The event was over, except that crack didn't disappear. It stayed exactly where it was. Every day after the event, players noticed it growing a little larger. Looking back, that's what made this event so special. It wasn't just a 10-minute spectacle that everybody forgot about afterward. It permanently changed the island and gave players a reason to log in every week just to see what was going to happen next. And whatever the visitor had done, it wasn't finished. It's easy to forget how different Fortnite was in 2018. Today, live events are expected. Players count down the days until the next one, but the rocket event was the first live event. Nobody knew if Epic Games could pull it off, and nobody expected it to become the beginning of one of gaming's most recognizable traditions. When Season 5 launched, players quickly realized the island hadn't just changed, but it had been rearranged. The lush swamps of Moisty Mires had completely disappeared, and in their place was a sprawling desert, unlike anything Fortnite had seen before. Scattered across the island were objects that didn't seem to belong there at all. Viking buildings appeared on mountaintops, and massive dinosaur skeletons emerged from the ground. It was almost as if pieces of different worlds had been stitched together. Then, Drift had simply been spray painting the giant Durr Burger after it had mysteriously appeared in the California desert. Before he even had a chance to finish it, a rift opened beneath him and pulled him straight into Fortnite. It was the first real glimpse that the rifts weren't just affecting the island, they were connecting entirely different realities. Looking back now, this was one of the first major hints that Fortnite's story was much bigger than the island itself. At the time, most players were just having fun exploring the new map and trying to figure out where everything had come from. For a while, things seemed relatively calm. Then, players started looking back at the sky. The rift had changed. The bright blue energy that had stretched across the island since the rocket event had slowly turned purple. Then came the lightning. Bolts began to strike the same hill in the desert over and over again. Sitting quietly in the middle of the desert was a giant purple cube. One thing that made Chapter 1 feel so different was how patient Epic Games was with the story. Kevin the Cube didn't appear during a live event or a cinematic. Players simply logged in after an update and discovered him standing there. There was no explanation, no objective, and no dialogue. Just a giant glowing cube that somehow became the biggest mystery in the game. The moment players discovered the giant purple cube sitting in the middle of the desert, one question immediately spread throughout the community. What was it? And Epic Games didn't answer. There wasn't a cutscene explaining where it came from or what it wanted. There wasn't even an official name for it. Somewhere along the way, though, the community started calling it Kevin, and somehow the name just stuck. And at first glance, Kevin the Cube didn't seem all that dangerous. Players could walk right up to it, smack it with their pickaxe, or even touch its glowing surface. Getting too close launched you backwards with a blast of purple energy, making the cube feel more mysterious than threatening. Then Kevin the Cube moved. It wasn't fast, and in fact, it was almost painfully slow. Every few days, the cube would roll to a new location, leaving behind a strange glowing rune burned into the ground before continuing on its way. Nobody knew why it chose these locations or what the symbols meant. That uncertainty became the story. Instead of waiting for a live event, players started checking Kevin's locations after every update. Social media filled with screenshots tracking its path across the island. While new theories popped up almost daily, some believed the cube was searching for something. Others thought it was charging itself with energy. A few even wondered if it was alive. The truth was, nobody really knew. And looking back, it's funny how simple the idea was. Kevin the Cube wasn't fighting anyone. He wasn't destroying points of interest. Most of the time, he was just slowly rolling across the island. Yet somehow, the entire community couldn't stop watching. Week after week, Kevin the Cube continued its journey until it finally reached Loot Lake. Players gathered along the shoreline, wondering if this was where everything would finally make sense. Kevin the cube didn't stop at the edge. Instead, it rolled straight into the water. Slowly, the cube sank beneath the surface. As it dissolved, the lake turned into a glowing purple liquid, unlike anything players had seen before. Then, Kevin the cube disappeared completely, and for the second time in Chapter 1, Fortnite's biggest mystery had seemingly come to an end. One of the things Chapter 1 understood better than almost any live service game was pacing. Kevin the cube spent weeks traveling across the island without a single line of dialogue. By today's standards, that sounds incredibly slow, but back then, it worked, because the community became part of the story. Players weren't waiting for Epic Games to explain the mystery, they were trying to solve it themselves. For a little while, Loot Lake stayed quiet, the water remained a glowing shade of purple, and Kevin the cube was nowhere to be found. Players knew the story wasn't over, but nobody knew what to expect next. Then, with the launch of Season 6, Fortnite delivered one of its most memorable map changes. The island at the center of Loot Lake began to shake, trees swayed, rocks crumbled into the water. Then, slowly, the entire island lifted into the air. Suspended beneath it was Kevin the cube. Somehow, the cube hadn't been destroyed after all. It had been waiting beneath the lake, and now it was carrying the island with it. The floating island had arrived, and at first, it simply hovered over Loot Lake. But before long, it started moving. If you paid close attention during Season 5, its route probably looked familiar. One by one, the floating island traveled back to every rune Kevin had left behind. Whenever it reached one, the rune lifted out of the ground, glowing with that same purple energy as the cube before, being pulled onto the island itself. Then, the island drifted away, heading for the next one. Watching it all unfold, something finally became clear. Kevin the cube hadn't been wandering around the island for no reason. Every stop, every rune, every mile of that slow journey had been part of a much larger plan. Looking back, this might have been one of the smartest pieces of environmental storytelling Epic Games has ever done. Months earlier, players watched Kevin leave mysterious symbols across the island without any idea what they even meant. Season 6 revealed that those moments were not random at all. They were setting up a payoff that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. After collecting the final rune, the floating island drifted back above Loot Lake. For the first time in 2 weeks, it stopped moving. Whatever Kevin had been working towards, it had finally reached its final stage. Every update after that, players noticed something new. The cube wasn't as stable as it used to be. Cracks began spreading across its surface. The purple energy inside pulsed faster than ever before, almost like it was struggling to contain itself. Then, without warning, the floating island exploded. Massive chunks of rock were launched across the island, while pieces of Kevin rained down in every direction. Wherever those fragments landed, strange purple corruption spread across the landscape. Along with it came an entirely new threat: cube monsters. During Fortnitemares, those creatures appeared all across the island, forcing players to fight off waves of monsters in the middle of every match. It completely changed how Fortnite played for a few weeks, and whether you loved it or hated it, you definitely remember it. While players were busy dealing with the monsters, Kevin continued to change. The cube's outer shell slowly broke apart until only a glowing white core remained. It was unlike anything players had seen before. Then, on November 4th, 2018, Kevin finally reached its breaking point. A blinding flash consumed the island. Suddenly, everyone was gone. Players found themselves floating in an endless white space, with no weapons, no map, and no idea where they were. In complete silence, a single glowing butterfly drifted toward them. Naturally, everyone reached out to touch it, but the moment they did, the world shattered around them. Players were transported back to the island, only to discover that Loot Lake had been completely transformed. The corruption was gone, the cube monsters had vanished, and the storm surrounding the floating island had disappeared. In its place was a peaceful version of Loot Lake, covered in a bright grass, glowing water, and the shattered remains of Kevin resting quietly in the center. For a brief moment, it felt like the island had finally found peace. Even years later, the butterfly event still stands out because it wasn't trying to overwhelm players with explosions or giant battles. It slowed everything down. There was no dialogue explaining what had happened, no objective telling players where to go, just millions of people standing in complete silence, experiencing one of Fortnite's most beautiful moments together. That's a rare thing in multiplayer games, and it's a big reason the event is still remembered so fondly. For the first time in months, Fortnite's story felt quiet. Kevin was gone, Loot Lake had been transformed, and the island looked peaceful again. Then, players started noticing something out of the horizon. At first, it looked like a small patch of white floating in the ocean, but as the days went by, it grew a little larger. Before long, it became obvious. An iceberg was heading straight for the island. On December 6, 2018, it finally arrived. The impact reshaped the southwest corner of the map almost overnight. Entirely new locations appeared beneath a blanket of snow. Frosty Flights, Happy Hamlet, and Polar Peak suddenly became part of Fortnite's world, and making it one of the biggest map changes players have seen since the meteor crash in Dusty Depot. Exploring the new biome quickly raised another mystery. At the highest point on the island stood an enormous frozen castle, and inside sat a king. The Ice King remained completely still on his throne while players explored every corner of Polar Peak, and at first there wasn't much to uncover, but as the weeks passed, the snow and its ice surrounding the castle slowly began to melt. Little by little, more of Polar Peak was revealed. New hallways opened, frozen rooms became more accessible. Then, players found something hidden deep beneath the castle, a prison. Locked inside was a figure completely encased in ice. Whoever this was, they clearly weren't meant to escape. While players debated who the prisoner could be, another change was happening above them. The Ice King had finally awakened. Rising from his throne, he climbed to the highest point of the castle and raised a glowing shard into the sky. Moments later, clouds rolled in. Snow began falling across the entire island. What started as a light snowfall quickly became a full-blown blizzard. Visibility dropped, icy winds swept across the map, and before long, strange frozen creatures began appearing everywhere players landed. The Ice Legion had arrived. And looking back, it's interesting how differently Epic Games handled this compared to Kevin. Kevin's story was built almost entirely through mystery, but the Ice King made his presence known immediately. Within minutes of the live event ending, every player knew a powerful new force had taken control of the island. But as dramatic as the storm was, it wasn't the biggest problem hiding inside Polar Peak. That title belonged to the prisoner. One thing Chapter 1 did exceptionally well was making the island feel alive. The map wasn't just changed because a new season had started. It felt like it was reacting to the characters living on it. Polar Peak slowly thawing out over several weeks is a perfect example. Players weren't handed every answer on day one. They watched the mystery unfold piece by piece every time they logged in. The Ice King's storm had come to an end. The island began to thaw, the snow slowly settled, and life started returning to normal. But inside Polar Peak, the prison cell was empty. The mysterious prisoner had escaped. Players didn't have to wait long to find out where he had gone. High in the mountains overlooking the island, a small campsite suddenly appeared. Every update revealed another stage of the prisoner's transformation. The ice covering his body slowly melted away, replaced by glowing cracks of molten lava. Whoever had escaped Polar Peak, they weren't an ordinary prisoner. They were becoming something far more powerful. Then, with the launch of Season 8, the island had changed once again. New locations like Sunny Steps, Lazy Lagoon, and the volcano itself completely transformed that side of the island. Looking back, it's easy to remember Season 8 for the pirates and the jungle theme, but underneath all of that was a much bigger story quietly unfolding. The Fire King had returned, and he finally had a kingdom to rule. While players explored the new biome, another familiar group quietly made its return, the government. Just like they had after the meteor crashed back in Season 4, excavation crews began appearing across the island. At first, they dug near Fatal Fields and Dusty Divot, but those sites didn't reveal much. Then, they moved to Loot Lake. Week after week, the excavation grew larger. Eventually, workers uncovered a giant metal hatch buried beneath the lake. Nobody knew what it was, but one thing was obvious. It had been there long before players ever dropped onto the island. One thing I really appreciate about Season 8 is how many different stories were happening at once. On On one side of the map, you had pirates searching for treasure. On another, the Fire King was rebuilding his empire. And right in the middle of the island, Fortnite quietly introduced one of the biggest mysteries in the game's history. At the time, most players had no idea that hatch under Loot Lake would completely change how we understood Fortnite's story. Over the next few weeks, strange symbols began appearing around the island. One by one, giant keys slid into place around the vault, each requiring the community to complete a different challenge before it would lock into position. It was another one of those moments that made Chapter 1 feel different. Players weren't just watching the story unfold, they were helping move it forward. Once every key had been activated, there was only one thing left to do: wait. Then, on May 4th, 2019, the vault had finally opened. Inside of spawning into a normal match, every player was pulled beneath Loot Lake into a place unlike anything Fortnite had shown before. Everything was white, the air was silent, and floating in the center of the room was a glowing sphere of pure energy. Around it sat 6 vaulted weapons suspended in place as if waiting for a decision. Without any instructions, players instinctively started swinging their pickaxes. One by one, the pillars cracked. Before long, one weapon stood out above the rest: the drum gun. Within minutes, the community had voted it back into the game. Looking back, it's funny how much attention the drum gun received, because the real story wasn't the vote, it was what stood in the middle of the room, and at that time, players didn't know its name. Years later, we'd learn we were looking directly at the 0 point, the energy source at the center of Fortnite's reality. But before anyone had time to process what they had seen, everyone was pulled back to the island, and that's when everything started falling apart. The volcano erupted, fireballs rained across the map, one slamming into Retail Row, tearing through the shopping district. Another struck Polar Peak, cracking the frozen castle wide open. And perhaps most memorably, one crashed directly into Tilted Towers. The city that players had spent months expecting the meteor to destroy was finally gone. By the time the smoke cleared, the island looked completely different. This event is still one of the most unique things Fortnite has ever done. Instead of simply playing a cinematic, Epic let millions of people make a decision together. Whether you loved or hated the drum gun winning, everyone watching became part of the event itself. And somehow, one of Fortnite's biggest lore reveals ended up sharing the spotlight with a community vote. After the destruction caused by the volcano, the island entered a new era. The damage left behind wasn't ignored. Instead, it was rebuilt. Tilted Towers returned as Neo-Tilted, replacing familiar streets with towering skyscrapers and futuristic technology. Retail Row was transformed into a massive mega mall, while the volcano itself became Pressure Plant, a facility designed to harness its energy. Everywhere players looked, it felt like the island was embracing the future. At first glance, Season 9 felt optimistic. The island had survived yet another disaster. Life had moved on, but if you looked a little closer, there were signs that something just wasn't right. The vault beneath Loot Lake had been opened, and the 0 point was now exposed. While the island continued rebuilding above ground, something deep beneath Polar Peak had finally awakened. Players noticed something staring back at them, an eye. Hidden beneath the walls of Polar Peak was a massive creature trying to break free. Suddenly, everything made sense. The Ice King hadn't brought Polar Peak to the island to conquer it. He had brought it here to contain whatever was trapped inside. It wasn't long before the ice finally gave way. The creature burst out of Polar Peak, carrying part of the castle on its back as it disappeared into the ocean. Players watched from the shoreline as it circled the island over the following weeks, and this raised the same question. If that thing came back, what could possibly stop it? Fortunately, someone was already working on an answer. Inside Pressure Plant, construction had quietly began on something unlike anything Fortnite had attempted before. One thing I really appreciate about Season 9 is how it constantly rewarded players who paid attention. The monster wasn't introduced through a trailer or a cutscene. First, the eyeball, then a castle disappearing into the ocean. Week by week, Epic let the community discover the threat together, and every update made that anticipation just a little stronger. The construction inside Pressure Plant finally began to make sense. Piece by piece, the massive structure hidden beneath the facility took shape. Arms, legs, a towering metal frame. The island wasn't just building a weapon, it was building a defender. And throughout the season, players watched the mecha slowly come together. New parts arrived every week, and the anticipation kept growing as everybody wondered the same thing. When is the monster coming back? On July 20th, 2019, they finally got their answer. Without warning, the monster emerged from the ocean and began marching towards the island. Pressure Plant immediately came to life. Alarms echoed across the map as the mecha launched into action and landing directly in the monster's path. Then, Fortnite did something nobody expected. It turned into a giant monster movie. The two massive titans crashed into each other, leveling buildings as they fought across the island. Every punch sent shockwaves through nearby locations, while players could only watch from below as the battle unfolded around them. At first, it looked like the mecha had the upper hand, but the monster wasn't interested in destroying cities. It was heading somewhere else. Loot Lake, more specifically, the vault. The monster tore into the ground, trying to reach that same mysterious energy source players had seen during the unvaulting event, the 0 point. Realizing it was running out of options, the mecha did something almost unthinkable. It ripped the 0 point straight out of the vault. Holding the glowing sphere in its hand, the mecha unleashed an incredible burst of energy, turning the tide of the battle. Then came one of the most iconic moments in Fortnite history. The giant statue standing in Neo Tilted wasn't just a statue, it was a sword. The mecha pulled it from the ground, charged it with 0 point energy, and dove it straight through the monster's head. Just like that, the battle was over. The mecha stood victorious. Then, without any celebration, it looked back at the island one last time. It gave us a silent thumbs up and flew back into the sky. The island had been saved. At least, that's what everyone believed. Because while players celebrated the victory, almost nobody was paying attention to what had been left behind, the 0 point. Its protective shell had been shattered during the battle. For the first time, the energy holding Fortnite's reality together was completely exposed. It's hard to overstate just how big this event felt in 2019. Fortnite had already hosted several incredible live events, but this event was on a whole nother level. It wasn't just a spectacle, it felt like the payoff to months of storytelling. Watching the mecha and the monster battle across the island genuinely felt like watching the finale of a summer blockbuster, except millions of players were experiencing it together in real time. The monster was gone, the island had survived, but the battle left behind something far more dangerous than anyone realized. Floating above Loot Lake was the 0 point, and for the first time, it was completely exposed. At first, nothing happened. Players continued exploring the island while the strange sphere of energy hung silently above the lake. Then, as Season 10 began, it exploded. The blast sent a wave of energy across the island, freezing time itself. In an instant, the 0 point's explosion became suspended in midair, almost as if reality had paused before it could completely collapse. Looking around the map, players immediately noticed something impossible. Dusty Depot had returned. Not a rebuilt version, but the original Dusty Depot. Even more surprising, the meteor that had destroyed it years earlier was now frozen in the sky, suspended just moments before impact. It was like pieces of Fortnite's past had been pulled back into the present. As the season continued, the island became increasingly unstable. Locations didn't just change, they were rewritten. Neo Tilted became Tilted Town, where building was completely disabled. Retail Row returned, but cube monsters once again wandered its streets. Paradise Palms merged with Moisty Myers, creating Moisty Palms. Gotham City appeared as part of the Batman crossover. Greasy Grove returned with an unexpected taco twist, and even the floating island made its return. None of it followed normal logic. Reality itself was starting to break down. In the middle of all of this chaos, another familiar face quietly returned, the Visitor. But this time, he wasn't alone. Hidden inside Dusty Depot, players discovered recordings left behind someone known as the Scientist. As players collected each tape, a bigger picture slowly came into focus. The Scientist remembered just enough to know that reality was collapsing. He spoke about the loop, about failing to remember, and about a plan that had to work before everything was lost. Unlike Unlike most of Fortnite's storylines, Epic didn't spell this one out. Players spent weeks piecing the recordings together, trying to understand what the scientist was preparing for. All anyone knew for certain was that another rocket was being built. I think Season 10 is one of Fortnite's most misunderstood seasons. At the time, most conversations focused on the rift zones and gameplay changes. Looking back, the real story was that reality itself was coming apart because the 0 point had been damaged, and every strange map change was another sign that the island was running out of time. By the end of Season 10, it was clear that the island couldn't survive much longer. The 0 point had become increasingly unstable. Reality itself was breaking apart, and the scientists had spent weeks preparing for one final attempt to stop everything from collapsing. Then, on October 13th, 2019, the plan was finally set into motion. Players loaded into what would become one of the most memorable events in gaming history. Standing on the island, everything seemed strangely quiet. Then, without warning, the rocket launched. It looked almost identical to the one the Visitor had launched back in Season 4, but this time, everyone knew it wasn't alone. Moments later, rifts began opening across the sky. One rocket became 2, then 3, 4, 5, and 6, until rockets were flying across the island from every direction. It was the first time players truly understood why they were called the Seven. Every rocket moved with perfect precision, weaving around the island before converging on one final destination. Up until that moment, the meteor had remained suspended exactly where it was when Season 10 began. Then, the rockets opened one final rift. Time resumed, and for the first time in years, the meteor started moving again. It came crashing down as it was always meant to, straight into the 0 point. But the impact was unlike anything Fortnite had shown before. The 0 point collapsed in on itself. Buildings, mountains, trees, even the battle bus. Everything was pulled towards its center. Players desperately tried to escape as the island itself began folding into the growing singularity. Within moments, there was nothing left. The island that millions of players had called home for over 2 years was gone. All that remained was a black hole, and then nothing. No map, no lobby, no countdown. Just a blank screen with a single swirling light at its center. For nearly 2 days, Fortnite disappeared. No one could play, no one knew it was coming next. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine a game taking a risk like this. Epic Games turned its biggest game completely offline, leaving millions of players staring at a black screen for almost 48 hours. It wasn't just an ending, it was the moment the entire gaming industry stopped to watch. Eventually, a new light appeared, the black hole collapsed, the camera pushed forward, and for the first time, players laid eyes on a brand new island. Chapter 1 had come to an end. Looking back, it's easy to see why so many players still talk about Chapter 1 with so much excitement. It wasn't just because of the map, or the weapons, or the memories of landing at your favorite POI. It was because every few weeks, it felt like the island had another story to tell. A meteor became the Visitor launched the rocket tore open reality, the rift brought Kevin led to the butterfly event, the Ice King arrived, the prisoner escaped, the vault was opened, the 0 point was exposed, the monster attacked, reality collapsed, and in the end, the island disappeared. Whether you started playing in Season 1 or jumped in somewhere along the way, Chapter 1 was more than just Fortnite's beginning. It was the foundation of everything that came after. And for a lot of players, it still feels like the chapter that defined Fortnite. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.